Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another tier list using Tier Maker, this time revisiting the Nurgle roster. So Nurgle's a faction that we've covered before when the game first came out, over 2 years ago, when they had like 14 units and were almost exclusively demons and it just had a very limited roster. But now they've had essentially 2 DLCs adding units for them, where they've had the Champions of Chaos adding a whole bunch of mortal units, and also Thrones of Decay adding in a whole bunch of variety of units. So now their roster is, twice the size that it used to be, and they've also had a bit of a rework in how their faction functions as well. So no longer do you pay money for their military structures, you pay for them with infections. They still have a cyclical way of adding units to their recruit pool, and then those units becoming available and recruited essentially from a global recruit pool, similar to how things functioned in Thrones of Britannia. But Nurgle is a very unique race, and so we need to take that into consideration when rating these units. Because this is a campaign tier list, it's not at all based in multiplayer. Every now and again you get a few people saying, but in multiplayer this. Look, it's not a multiplayer tier list, I'm not taking that into consideration whatsoever. So I will be taking the availability of these units, the cost effectiveness, I think, of these units, what roles they play, whether or not that's actually useful for Nurgle, because the enemy armies that you are likely to go up against, especially in the early game, should be dictating essentially what you're recruiting. You want to be recruiting units that those factions are going to have a harder time dealing with, as opposed to units that just have overall high stats but may actually be countered by the enemy forces. Okay, so let's get into that. So starting with the Nurglings, this is a unit that is going to be very widely available for you. Huge recruitment pool for them very early on. But they're super cheap and they're weak. This is a unit that will likely get wiped out. You will lose a lot of these guys throughout your campaign, and it's not something to cry over whenever they get wiped out, because it's kind of, these guys here just fill in gaps in your army until the better units start increasing in numbers and you start to really build up your forces. So losing these guys not that big of a deal. But this is basically what Nurgle needs to fill up their army until that time. So it's kind of an essential part of the Nurgle army. So I'm going to put them at B tier because they are definitely necessary, but they're also weak. So then you can't rely on them too heavily. Now, Kugath can obviously boost them by a ton, and it is potentially possible to get a very good Nurgling army going, but you have to put a lot of effort into doing that, and you can certainly make much better armies than them. So I'm going to put them at B tier of that. And also, I'm not going to base a unit just on one legendary lord's ability. It's going to be about the entirety of the Nurgle race, so all of the lords' availability for getting them. Now we move on to the Plague Bearers. So this is another unit that's going to be pretty regularly available. They have about similar sort of frequency as Nurgles, maybe not quite as many. This is a more expensive unit. This is one that you would probably prioritize over Nurglings, just based on availability. But they are slow. They got loads of health, they're quite durable, but they've also got low armor, and they can potentially be killed very quickly, especially by magic. So this isn't a unit that's going to dish out a whole bunch of damage, and damage is how you win battles. So I would not say that this is like a critical component of any army for Nurgle, but in the early stages of the campaign, which they are readily available, you'll have them in absolute abundance, and they're definitely going to perform better in auto resolve than Nurglings. And so this should be a priority over Nurglings if you have the money for them, because they are a bit more expensive. I'm going to put them at B tier because they're basically just a tier above Nurglings in terms of their overall strength, but serving a very similar purpose, just holding the line, tanking rather than dishing out damage. And I always value damage dealers, or units that I suppose have a really specialist purpose that only they can perform, over units that there are other options for this. I guess that's the big thing when it comes to Plague Bearers. You have so many options in the melee infantry department that there is just nothing really that special about these guys. It's just like, oh look, it's a demon with high health. There's loads of those, really. Okay, then we move on to the Exalted Plague Bearers. So these guys will be available fairly early on as well. I like tier 2. These ones, however, are better than the regular Plague Bearers because they have an added tactical flexibility with like a javelin attack. So a small amount of ammunition, but these ones have more health, more overall stats, and for only a moderate increase in price in terms of upkeep and recruitment costs, but one thing is that their availability will be a lot lower than Plague Bearers. But the thing is with these ones, once you get them, this is the kind of unit that it's probably not going to get wiped out as easily as these two. So once you get them, it feels a little bit more permanent in the army. So I'm actually going to put this one at A tier, because you've got a lot of damage dealing with those missile attacks. It gives you a lot more versatility, and you've still got that really tanky unit at only a slightly, like I said, moderately increased price point. So I think that the value proposition on that one is significantly higher, largely thanks to that missile attack, which can actually do an absolute ton of damage if shot correctly. Okay, then we move on to some more mortal units. There's loads of melee infantry for mortals in Nurgle roster here. Now, so the Marauders, you've got the regular variant that's good against nothing, and then you've got the what's it called, anti-armor variant. They'll both be available as of tier 1 in similar amounts of unit pools, like availability. I usually just skip these units because when it comes to Nurgle melee infantry, like you've got your physical resistance one here, but you've only got 3 types, 3 demons there, right? Whereas you've got a lot of options here for mortals. Now, these ones don't have physical resistance, but what they do have in some cases is more durability. So these are at tier 1, but at tier 2, you start to get access to Chaos Warriors. So I kind of just skip these guys because they don't have much armor. This one's got shields. You've got armor piercing in a stage of the campaign where you don't really need a lot of armor piercing. So I just don't think that these are high value in the stage of the campaign that you get them. And because you're not playing as Warriors of Chaos, who are able to just upgrade them when they get enough experience, this is a unit that I feel like I recruit, and then as soon as I get Chaos Warriors, I'm like, I kind of regret my purchase of these guys. So I usually just try to... basically this. I get them only until I've got access to these guys, and then I just skip them entirely. So I'm gonna put them at C tier there. Now, on the other hand, another tier 1 unit, the Forsaken of Nurgle. This one is less readily available, but has a lot of armor, for a tier 1 unit, and actually has damage dealing, and is even quite quick. So anything that these guys can do, this one can kind of just do better. And like I said, they're available at the same tier. Now, obviously, the Forsaken's going to be a little bit more expensive, but when you've got something that's just straight up better, available at the exact same tier, like, why wouldn't you recruit this one? Again, in a case of just finances. So I'm going to put that at A tier, because this is like a really good early game unit if you're going up against enemies that just don't have that much armor piercing. So you've got an edge upon them, especially, like, for example, vampire counts. If you're playing as Kugath, it's actually pretty good to get some of these guys here, because the vampire counts have a lot of non-armor piercing units. And so these guys here that can tank them quite well, can tank them kind of better than Plague Bearers. Okay, then we've got the Chaos Warriors. Now, Chaos Warriors being recruitable at tier 2 in a decent amount of, frequency. You've got the regular variant that has basically just shields and no speciality in terms of what units it goes up against. High melee defense, high health, because of the Mark of Nurgle. And then you've got the armor piercing. Now, at tier 2, you might be starting to go up against armor piercing, but these guys here, they really do whack a punch. Now, I've tested these guys like toe-to-toe against Tzeentch Chaos Warriors, and usually what happens is Nurgle wins pretty much every single time when going up against Tzeentch in a melee fight, which is weird because I've always considered Tzeentch to be like the hard counter to Nurgle. So these guys here now solve a purpose against Tzeentch. So I'm going to put these guys here at A tier, because to be honest, when you're playing as the Nurgle factions on Immortal Empires, you're actually not really going up against any Tzeentchian factions, with the exception of Epidemius, who starts at war with a Tzeentchian faction, but that Tzeentchian faction is an absolute pushover. But also when it comes to Epidemius, he is heavily incentivized to focus on demons as opposed to mortals. But playing as Kugath or Tamrakhan, these guys here are a high priority to get. So usually I do build this structure here first, which includes them first as well. But I really want to try to get to tier 2 as quickly as possible and get a few of these guys in the army. A little bit expensive at the early stage of the campaign, but well worth it because they are cut above everything else that you're going to go up against, which again gives you a decisive edge upon your enemies. Then we've got the Chosen of Nurgle, which are available at tier 3. Now, getting this kind of elite unit at tier 3, that's super early, especially when compared to other factions' elite infantry. They are very expensive, but the fact that you're getting them that early means that one of these guys is going to be able to deal with numerous other units. Some, like, at the same time, they're going to get hundreds of kills in a single battle. You've got your durability guy here with this huge amount of defense and high hit points, because that's what the Mark of Nurgle does. Extra hit points, extra melee defense at the cost of melee attack. So you got your defensive line here, which of course you could couple that with a spellcaster that has Stream of Corruption. That's a super powerful combination. And if you need your armor piercing, these guys here absolutely whack a punch. Both of these two are going into A tier. Now, if you're wondering, why don't the stronger units end up in S tier? Because it's about value proposition, availability, and also the tier that they're recruited on. So, in my opinion, these guys are recruited a tier earlier than they probably should be. Like, in my opinion, these guys are tier 4, and these guys are tier 3, right? But if I was able to recruit these at tier 1, I'd probably put them at S tier. And if I was able to recruit these at tier 2, then yeah, they go in S tier. But like I said, they're just not recruited a little bit earlier than I would have otherwise expected. So I really do like them, but if you want, again, why am I putting them next to each other? Same amount of value that they provide based on the tier and also the upkeep cost. Obviously, the Chosen are stronger units, but in a game where you have limited amounts of funds, you know, they're going to provide very similar amounts of value. Okay, then we move on to the Pestigors. Now, Pestigors are a bit of a weird one because I feel like they're not really providing any niche in the Nurgle roster because they've got so many melee infantry, right? And they've got a special ability, but that special ability is just not really that big of a deal. So what they do, they can only use it once per battle. They slow down the enemy unit by 75% and make them tired by 1% per second for 20 seconds. Their overall combat stats are somewhere between Marauders and Chaos Warriors, and they're recruited at the same tier as Chaos Warriors. I just don't see a whole lot of value for them, apart from the fact that they're cheaper, but I guess that's the whole purpose of them. They're just supposed to be, I guess these are low tier, and then there's high tier, and this is supposed to be mid tier. And typically speaking, mid infantry don't really impress me much because it's a jack of all trades, master of nothing. It just doesn't do that much. Like, they got lower damage output than the Chaos Warriors recruited at the same time. For the price point, I just don't see the value in it. I mean, they're a little bit faster, but you know, that's not really Nurgle shtick anyway. And you've got faster units available in other areas, so I'm going to put this one here at C tier. You definitely can get some value out of them. I just think you have better options, which is why I put them at C. Okay, then let's move on to some faster units. We got the Marauder Horsemen of Nurgle throwing axes. So these ones here, this is your fast early game unit, available at tier 1. They are very quick, especially considering they've got the Mark of Nurgle. Mark of Nurgle doesn't slow them down, it just doesn't give them additional speed. So they've got reasonably high health. They've got armor-piercing damage, they've got poison damage, and they're quick, so they're able to run down routing units. In my opinion, this is your early game solution for dealing with mortal units that are kind of cowardly, and dealing with armor-piercing opponents. So if you go up against a heavy cavalry unit in the early stages of the campaign, the Marauder Horsemen of Nurgle throwing axes are basically a perfect solution. Let's just say hypothetically you're going up against a Grail Knight, which you're not going to go up against Grail Knight early game, but let's just say hypothetically you were. This unit can actually beat a Grail Knight because a Grail Knight can't catch it, really, and these guys here just punch through their armor. So they go into A tier straight away. Definitely not S tier, but this is a good unit. You can get a lot of value out of it. Even if they end up using all their ammunition and not killing the Grail Knight, don't forget, the Grail Knight is worth so much more than these Marauder Horsemen. So it's about value. These guys here can punch way above their pay grade. They've got multiple different purposes throughout your army, a lot of versatility, and that's really what Nurgle needs, especially when you've got a lot of basically samey units, and you also have very limited missile roster. You've got one pretty good missile unit for skirmishing, so very good at getting rid of enemy cavalry and staying out of taking damage themselves. Okay, then we've got the Warhound of Chaos Warhound with poison. So if this was Warriors of Chaos, I would put this as S tier, because the Warriors of Chaos, what they can do with this unit is absolutely insane. This unit, for them, can get 90% physical resistance, can get Gore Feast. There's just so much you can do with them. But for Nurgle, they can't do any of that stuff. It doesn't get loads of physical resistance, doesn't get Gore Feast. So it just kind of exists within the roster and gets kind of forgotten about. So not much you can do to boost them. They're definitely not bad units though, especially because they're super early game. They're very fast. They're faster than the Marauder Horsemen, so they're good at running down, let's just say, other Marauders Horsemen counterparts. But you're unlikely to go up against a ton of those kind of units. So I'm going to put it at C tier just because I think that this one here is what you need in the early stage of the campaign and performs a better role than them. But I'm not saying they're bad units, I'm just saying that this one here fills a better role than them. Again, it's the same sort of problem that these guys have, where you've got similar units providing the same role, but just better at it. That's my thoughts. And they've also got extremely low leadership. That's another thing to keep in mind. But yeah, if it had the physical resistance that the Warriors of Chaos could get them to have access to, I'd definitely rate them differently. So C tier for them. Okay, then we move on to some heavy cavalry. So the Knights of Nurgle, and then the Knights with Lancers. So I'm not a huge fan of super heavy cavalry that don't have speciality. So these guys here neither have anti-large or anti-infantry. They'll say anti-infantry in their like bio, but it's just saying that stuff doesn't mean anything. Yeah, they got poison attack. Yeah, they got some extra like everything in Nurgle's roster has got poison attack. So having these guys also inflict poison attack is just not really going to do anything. I think because you can only apply poison once essentially on a unit at a time. And you've just got other units that are, I think, in my opinion, doing the same role much earlier. Like, obviously, these are super heavily armored, but the thing is, they're recruitable at tier 4. I think that's the big problem there with these guys. They're recruited super late tier, and by the time you get to tier 4, the kind of enemies that you're going up against that are also recruiting at tier 4, they're just kind of better than what these guys are, because they are very expensive. But another thing to keep in mind is that if you just wait one more tier, you get access to a vastly better unit than it that actually has a lot of speciality and utility. So I usually just skip over these guys here entirely. I don't think they're very good. I would not really recommend getting them. If you need cavalry at that stage of the campaign, I would still highly recommend going with these guys here. Because again, these guys just aren't really performing the roles that they need to. They're relatively slow compared to other types of cavalry. Like, they're only at 70 speed. So I'm actually going to put these guys here at D tier. Now, I get it. How can you put them at D tier? Look at their stats. High stats, how can they be a D tier? Their stats don't matter that much. It's they recruit late, you don't get a ton of availability for them, and you've got other options that are available that are so much better than them. That's what it really comes down to there, and that needs to be taken into consideration. So that's why I'm putting them at D tier. Basically, I just skip over this unit because Rot Knights exist, right? Now, Rot Knights, they come at tier 5, so you do have to wait a little bit longer for them, but it's worth the wait. They're faster, they hit harder, they have regeneration by default, they've got smaller entities, so they're only at 32 as opposed to 60, but that can actually be an advantage because they have higher mass, meaning they're able to get out of like sticky infantry combat a lot easier, but also that means every entity has more health than a regular Chaos Knight. So it takes more hits to kill an individual because regen can't revive someone from death, but it can revive someone who has taken severe damage but isn't quite dead yet. So it's actually really useful that they've actually got smaller entity numbers. So I'm actually going to go with this one straight up to S tier. Like I said, skip them, and that's only because this one is so good. Also, Kha'Zix the Befouled is able to boost Rot Knights by such a ridiculous degree that just looking at Chaos Knights now, I just think, why even bother compared to what you can do with Rot Knights? Just such a better unit. And the thing is, by the time you get these guys here, this is when you start to deal with the enemy's big monsters, and it's anti-large. So it solves the purpose exactly when you start to run into that problem, and it's a problem that these guys here do not solve. They're very bad at dealing with single entities. They're bad at dealing with monstrous units. They're good at dealing with early game units that are like archers, crossbowmen, that kind of stuff. But you've already got other units that are good against them as well. And the units roster now has got other units in here that are recruited much earlier that can perform that role better than them. So again, that's why they're down low, even though they are, strong units. Again, they come in too late, and by the time they show up, their purpose is kind of obsolete. So they just become out. This is the problem. This is the thing. It's the opposite situation of these guys here, right? Like, these guys here, in my opinion, they should be recruited at tier 2. Because I think that, or tier 3, maybe. So these guys here are, in my opinion, the equivalent of Chaos Warriors, or even in between Chaos Warriors and Chosen. They shouldn't be higher tier than Chosen, in my opinion. Because if you look at it in terms of Chaos Warriors, right? When you've got a Chaos Warrior of Nurgle, you can turn that unit into a Knight or a Chosen. But why are the Chosen units actually lower tier than the Chaos Knights? It just kind of doesn't make sense to me in that regard. Like the Chaos Warrior skill tree, I guess, with the Warband system just makes a lot more sense. So I would actually rate them a lot higher within Warriors of Chaos. Okay, then we've got the Chariot unit. So this one here you'll get a little bit earlier. So basically tier 3. Again, these guys here, their problem gets solved earlier by other units. So you've got your anti-infantry fast unit. They're quicker than these knights by 8 points. They've got anti-infantry. And because they've only got 4 entities, that actually gives them a bit of an advantage if you're fighting multiple battles over the course of a turn. As long as your entities don't get killed, at the end of the battle, they get their health back. Whereas these guys here, it's hard to charge them into a infantry line or something and get them out without them taking 1 or 2 casualties. It can be such a pain dealing with these knights. Whereas chariots could just plow through things. Now, obviously, if you send a chariot unit up against a knightly unit, they're going to get wrecked. But they're much more specialist. And I think that being, as I've said so many times before, being a jack of all trades is not as valuable as being specialist. Being amazing at your job is better than being mediocre at everything, in my opinion. So I'm going to put this one here at B tier because, again, they're not good at everything. They serve a very specific purpose, but they're pretty good at that purpose. So that's where they go. Okay, then we move on to the flyer type units. So we got the Furies here. Now, previously, I probably would have rated the Furies fairly low, but they've since been boosted. This is a unit that you can recruit at a reasonable frequency, not heaps of them. You can recruit them at tier 1. But this is a unit that you should expect. It's basically like a flying Nurgling, except it's going to dish out loads of damage, but expect these ones to die very, very often. So you have to replace them a fair bit. I don't really like units that I have to replace all the time. But in an emergency situation, this is actually a pretty good unit. So I'm actually going to put it at B tier because it solves the role that it's needed. It's fast, gets in there, gets rid of the missile infantry, but it will probably get killed if it fights anything higher than that. Okay, then we've got Rot Flies. So this is a bit of a weird unit in my opinion because they're available at tier 2. They look like they're heavier than they are. They actually have kind of really crappy mass. When they like fight a infantry unit, they kind of get stuck. Like if it's not going their way, it's really hard to pull them out of the fight, and so they end up taking an absolute ton of damage. These guys also have very low combat stats, so they tend to lose a lot of combats if you're not extremely careful. You have to really carefully pick and choose the combat that you use with these guys. But surprisingly, Rotflies are really good at dealing with things like dragons. It's very surprisingly good against them. However, in the early stages of the game, at tier 2, you're not really going to be encountering many dragons. So having these guys in reserve for when you go and fight Imric, awesome. But until then, I'm not recruiting them. I'm going to put it at C tier because they're not completely useless, but they're just not that great. Not units that I like to focus on in my campaigns. Then we've got the plague drones of Nurgle. So these guys are basically rotflies with a rider on top of them being a plague bearer. These ones have just better stats, but funnily enough, this is actually available at tier 1 from a different build chain. So this unit here is actually recruited later than them, but this one is recruited early. I guess you can recruit that one from like a minor settlement. Well, actually, there's nothing stopping you from recruiting. Sorry, this one here could probably only be recruited from a major from a major settlement. So these ones here are available earlier than this one's essentially, and has better combat stats. So I'm actually going to put that at B tier. So this one here just becomes kind of superfluous. I mean, they're both melee focused flying units, but this one's just got better stats. It's a bit weird. It's a bit weird how they've done that with the Rotflies there. Okay, and then we've got the Plague Drones of Nurgle, Death's Head. So these ones are available pretty early on as well. And they have a missile attack on top of being identical in terms of their melee capabilities. I'd also put them at B tier because their missile attack is nothing too fancy. They're kind of slow at shooting. They don't do a lot of damage, but it is a way for them to dish out damage and not get hit themselves. So if you're up against a lot of like anti-large infantry, but they can't hit you, then this could be a solution to that potentially. But if they go into melee with them, they're obviously going to struggle. I think these two here, they perform at expectation. And the thing is, you get them fairly early on. So if if they're not really doing it for you, it's not really that big of a deal. Just replace them with better units down the track. Okay, so this one here first. So then we move on to Plague Toads. So Plague Toads, I have never really been that much of a fan of. These are recruited in the early stages of the campaign. They are slow. For like a monstrous like cavalry type unit, I guess. They're considered war beasts, right? But their speed is 65, so they're slower speed than Chaos Knights. Will obviously recruit at tier 1. They start off with anti-infantry, but they can get anti-large as well. But I overall think that these guys are kind of too big and too slow. They get killed so friggin' easily. They've got so many weaknesses that unless the exact ideal situation is happening for them, I usually just try to skip this unit. I would only recruit it if I just had nothing else available and I just needed extra bodies in my army. But I usually have to be very careful with these guys. So I do sometimes recruit them, but out of necessity rather than desire. So I'm going to put that at C tier. Then we've got the Pox Riders of Nurgle, which are recruited at tier 1, so earlier than these guys. Well, they're recruited at tier 1 as well, but they're from a major building as opposed to a minor. And these guys are just stronger versions of them. That's all it is. They're just stronger. In terms of the upkeep cost difference, you know, it makes sense given their, like, these ones here are going to dish out damage where these guys here kind of just don't dish out anywhere near as much. I mean, obviously it's a higher stat unit, but being available at tier 1 gives them more value than the regular Plague Toads. So I'm going to put them a tier above because I kind of feel like these are a tier 2 unit where those are a tier 1. So recruited a little bit earlier than you, maybe at the same tier as you're supposed to. I don't know. But I feel like these are a bit more worthy than the regular Plague Toads. I just don't think these ones here provide much value. Okay, then we've got the Chaos Spawn. So there's a fair few options now that that Nurgle has for monstrous infantry. Now all of these guys here essentially solve the same role. So I'll just say this right away. One of these guys is way better than all the others. And you'd probably be surprised who I'm going to pick. And it's not going to be the Chaos Spawn, right? So it's recruited at tier 3. They're relatively slow. They've got okay combat stats. They're considered anti-infantry, but they don't actually have anti-infantry. It's just that the amount of weapon strength that they have, it does reasonably well against infantry because it doesn't quite overkill them, but it kills them fairly quickly. But if they go up against like monster units, they tend to flail around and take a while to actually dish out damage. There's nothing particularly special about the spawn of Nurgle when you compare them to the other variants of spawns from the other Chaos Gods. Like, for example, Slaanesh, having the support, I can't remember, the Musk, the debuff that they provide is kind of better than having poison attacks, especially when everything else in your roster also has poison attacks, whereas not everything has Superphoric Musk, or whatever it's called. Probably mispronounced that, or whatever. And so other variants of spawns vastly outperform Spawn of Nurgle just due to having tactical flexibility. So, as an example, other examples, you got Frenzy with Khorne, you got the Barrier with Zinch, and when it comes to Nurgle, you just got more health, which these guys take damage pretty quick anyway, so it's not a huge amount of value. And then, of course, you've got more melee defense, but reduced melee attack, which is a bit weird for a unit that's considered a damage dealer. They kind of need melee attack. So when it comes to this guy here, I'm just going to put it at D tier because the role that this performs is solved by other units that come in earlier. I just skip it. Anyway, we'll get into other units actually right now. So then we've got the two variants of the Plague Ogres. So Plague Ogres are all right, especially if you put them in Tamarkan's army. They are recruited from the major settlement structure. You can get them at tier 3. They're pretty good. They're not fantastic, they're pretty good. I'm going to put them at B tier because I think they perform the exact role that's supposed to. But here's my major complaints with them. They are a bit slower than their non-Chaos Corrupted counterparts. Like Ogre Bulls from Ogre Kingdoms are faster than these guys. Now, speed is really important when you're that fat, because if something's shooting at you, you need to close that distance right away. The extra health that they have doesn't compensate them enough, in my opinion, for that speed. However, one advantage they do have for Nurgle that isn't performed by any other units in their roster is they're able to smash down walls, which I don't think is the most important thing ever, but it is something that they can do for you. So you can break through multiple sections of walls using Plague Ogres, without requiring artillery, which of course you don't have as Nurgle. Not really, but we'll get into that in a little bit. I mean, talking about the Soul Grinder. So yeah, these guys here, I think they perform exactly where they're supposed to. Again, much higher prioritize recruiting them over these ones here. And this is why I put this at D tier, because they're recruited at the same tier. From different buildings, mind you. So this is from major settlement only, whereas this can be recruited in minor settlement. But at the same time, most people tend to prioritize building up their major settlements more than their minor settlements. But it varies from player to player. But yeah, I think that these are significantly better than Chaos Spawn. That's why they end up in B tier and these end up in D tier. And then it comes to the Bile Trolls. Now, if you've been watching my channel for years, you know that I shit on trolls, which in many cases the Bile Trolls might like. However, when it comes to Warhammer 3, I'm a troll convert. Trolls are fucking good in Warhammer 3, and Bile Trolls are the best. So Bile Trolls are going into S tier, because if you need monstrous infantry, Bile Trolls, that's your solution. Because guess what? These are tier 2, right? You can get these guys... sorry, no, they're not tier 2, they're tier 3. You get them at the same tier as the other monstrous infantry. But here's the advantage that Bile Trolls have over everyone else. I could be biased as well because they're super good in the Warriors of Chaos roster, but they've got regeneration. They're reasonably quick. They're the fastest of the monstrous infantry, which speed matters for these units. You want to close in quickly. They've got a reasonable amount of armor. They've got regeneration. As far as trolls are concerned, they've got higher leadership than average. They've got really good combat stats, so they're able to dish out damage, and they have corrosive bile, so they're actually providing a debuff. These guys here support your units better than everything else in the monstrous infantry part of the Nurgle roster. Bile Trolls are the shit. So I really like Bile Trolls, especially when I play Warriors of Chaos. And again, that may be influencing some of this. Maybe they actually deserve to be A tier, but I think I'm biased towards the Bile. I mean, these guys, I think they're really good because you'll get a good amount of them. Tier 3, I think. I think this is a tier 4 unit, personally. I think they're just better than everything else here in terms of the monstrous infantry. Okay, so now we're moving on to single entity monsters now. So there are the Beast of Nurgle. Now, I believe I put this one as an S tier unit before. And to be honest, I think it's an S tier unit now, still. Because it's available at tier 1. And this is a single entity monster that has regeneration, decent amount of damage, and it's got a debuff, Slime Trail. That's really good. And Slime Trail, that stacks with Corrosive Bile. So these guys here, they make a really friggin' good team. So when you're building your armies, especially when it comes to unit pools, where you don't have to spam one unit type at the early stage of the campaign, planning your armies across like multiple different stackable debuffs on the enemy, that is exactly what Nurgle's all about. So these guys here, they work wonders together. Have a bit of a melee infantry to fill in the gaps between the units, and these guys work really, really well. So that's why they're getting into S tier. Regeneration means you don't have to waste magic on them. They can just regenerate themselves, so you can focus on damage dealing, which is how you win battles. So that's why I think they're just really good units, especially considering tier 1. That's really early for like a pretty strong unit like that. Okay, then we've got the plague, what's it called? The great unclean one, sorry. So these guys here, this is interesting because previously I've said certain units are like better in the Warriors of Chaos roster. And these Warriors of Chaos do get access to these guys, but this is definitely better in Nurgle roster because of the bound spells that they have are really good. Like Nurgle Law of Magic is, in my opinion, the best out of the demonic magics. And playing as Nurgle, you can of course give these guys bound spells, and quite a few of them. I think they get 2 for each one. They're also pretty good in melee, but they're big and they're fat and they're slow, making them easy targets for missiles. However, I think that their huge pool of hit points and the fact that they can use fleshy abundance on themselves to heal, because they actually don't have regen on themselves, and you can boost them by a fair amount, and that Kugath provides some boost for them as well. I think they still belong in S tier, but you just need to be careful of that weakness, which is, long-range missiles will hit them. The AI will target you with these guys here, because they are extremely high value, but you can get so much value out of these guys here. because even just with their bound spells, not taking up Winds of Magic can be really good for you, and using some really fantastic spells. Like you've got Stream of Corruption, you've got the Blight Boss, you've got some loads of damage dealing stuff. You got the Rancid Visitation, so good to use against single entities as well. That's a very good like Spirit Leech type attack. So really good spells there, just used as bound, and I think that's why that is why I'm putting it on S tier there. Then we've got the Soul Grinder of Nurgle. Now, in my opinion, not all Soul Grinders are created equally, and the Nurgle Soul Grinder is actually the best. So this one here is kind of an artillery mortar piece. It's not good against walls, but it is really good at dishing out damage to huge clubs of infantry. So this one here will get loads of kills, and then go into melee and still perform quite well. And because you're playing as Nurgle, you will have access to heal magic, or if you've got access to one of these guys, you can heal them with it, if you're using up your bound spells. So using these guys here, and also they become available as of tier 4, which is pretty early for a very high value unit. So there's a lot you can do with Soul Grinders of Nurgle. They very rarely let me down. And that's usually, if they do let me down, it's largely because I didn't micro them very well. Okay, then we've got a bit of a weird one here with the Chaos Warshrine, right? So this is a unit that is available at tier 1, but it definitely looks like a higher tier unit. Now, I've got a bit of mixed thoughts on this one here, because you can have your heroes have mounts of the Chaos Warshrine. And so you don't really need to recruit a Chaos Warshrine if your hero has them, because you don't need multiple of them in an army, really. Maybe 1 or 2, right? Because their ability doesn't stack, which provides regen in an area. So if you're going with like a spam of like single entity monster type units, having one of these guys is really useful. But you've got this one at tier 1 way earlier than you may actually need it. The biggest problem with it though is just if you deal with a lot of missile units, they will target you. But otherwise, the fact that it's tier 1 actually kind of makes it A tier. So it's, like I said, a bit of a weird one, because I don't really like the unit that much, but the fact that you get it so early, it's like the opposite situation with these two. You know, it's just, you get it when you need it, or even before you need it, and you only need one of them, and it performs a pretty decent role in the army, but they do have a habit of getting sniped by the enemy. And again, you can replace it with heroes that are on that mount as well, like your cultist or whoever can get on that mount, and it serves the same purpose with higher stats, essentially. So I'd get it early on, and then phase it out for heroes, because the heroes ones will just be better. And then we've got Toad Dragons, and Toad Dragons are just fucking good, right? They are big monsters that just dish out shitloads of damage. They've got breath attacks. They do require a little bit of micro. You don't want to just leave them in combat getting hit by halberds, but you can do so much damage with these guys. They are very bloody strong. And there we go. There's the tier list for Nurgle. So previously, I think that the Nurgle roster was pretty weak, but the majority of their units end up in at or above B tier, and there's not that many that are in lower tier, and it's usually just due to, well, these units are superfluous. That's really what it came down to. So their speciality is performed by other units that are just better at it. So Nurgle's kind of got all those bases covered. What they don't have covered, I guess, is small arms fire, but that's not really ever going to be their speciality. And it's totally fine for a race to just not have one particular type of unit, or a couple of different types of units. I guess they don't have artillery either. So that's the roster. Much more robust than it used to be, for sure. But there's definitely room for a few more units, I think. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comments below what you think of this tier list. Again, I've tried to be as thorough as possible with my reasoning behind any of these units. It's not just about, is it strong stats and it goes up high? If it's low stats, it goes down low. Because, these have high stats, but I put them down low because they show up way too late. And their problems are solved by other units that you get earlier, in my opinion. Like taking out loads of infantry, like low tier infantry, is solved by monster units, which you get at tier 3. Guys, that's the end of this one. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Appreciate you. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Later, guys.